I'm sorry. I keep forgetting. Goofy blocks. All right, so whenever you're looking at these, you can think of a point as a dot. Even though a point is technically infinitely small, it doesn't have any size. We put a dot there to represent it. And we can think of a line as a series of points. So switching from looking at a number line, we're now going to the coordinate plane. And whenever we are describing a point, we will use an ordered pair represented by x and y. And that is called the coordinates of the point. So just some vocabulary words in the coordinate plane. Remember, the origin is 0, 0. In case these didn't copy very well on your paper, this is quadrant 1. And then it goes counterclockwise, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. Because I feel like at some point it'll tell you like point P is in quadrant 4, so you might have to know the location of those in case you forget. So the first formula that we have up is our distance formula. And now you'll notice it looks kind of like the Pythagorean theorem if it were solved for c instead of c squared, if you actually took the square root. So you will need 2 points, okay, which will be x sub 1, y sub 1, and x sub 2, y sub 2. And then you'll plug into this formula, which looks like our bell ringer question. It has a big square root, and we'll have parentheses x sub 2 minus x sub 1, parentheses squared, plus y sub 2 minus y sub 1 quantity squared. It's kind of like the slope formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, but different. But this is derived from the Pythagorean theorem. But the reason it's more complicated than the one I showed on the last slide was that instead of coming from the origin where you could just count like 3 and 4, sometimes your segment will be up here, so you would have to actually, calculate the distances a little bit differently and how you would find the lengths. Now, you do have to memorize this for your chapter test, which is on Tuesday next week. So, Sheridan would know math songs. No one else in here had me before, but I always share some math songs to help you memorize your formulas. There's a lot better ones for Algebra 2 for the quadratic formula, but nevertheless.
Distance formula, square root, x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Add squares together and take the square root. It's distance formula.
Now there's lots of other ones out there. This was actually the best one, surprisingly.
It sounds so sad.
Surprisingly, this was the best one that I found. But if you want, you can go to YouTube and look at some of the other ones that are not so great. But you need to memorize it however you memorize it. That's up to you. But we learned a lot of formulas in Algebra 2, and sometimes the songs did help, especially with the quadratic formula. As dorky as Mrs. Bennett is, right? But I've had several pre-calc students come back and be like, I was on my test and I heard your song as I was doing the quadratic formula. So I'll play it again closer to your test, and I'll also put the link on my Google Classroom in case anyone wants to listen to it, or put it on your iPod and listen to it on repeat. But you'll need to memorize it. So whatever helps you memorize, you know best. Okay? All right, so example 1 asks us, how far is the subway ride from Oak to Symphony? So this is a graph showing subway stops, and we can see that Oak is located here, and it has an ordered pair of -1, -2. So I'm going to write that right above Oak, no problem. Now be careful, Symphony, the Symphony stop actually doesn't have an ordered pair associated with it right now. The 2-4 goes to the Jackson stop. So we need to come up with an ordered pair to represent Symphony. Now be careful that you identify clearly where the x-axis is and where the y-axis is, because they're not very bold. It's kind of hard to see them sometimes. So who could tell me what the ordered pair for Symphony would be? Ordered pair for Symphony. Emma?
1, 2.
Good. 1, 2. And we're rounding the nearest 10th. Now on your homework, you're only going to have 4 questions that relate to the distance formula. So what I want is I want you to copy down the formula for every question, for all 4 questions. It's only 4 times. You can handle it. It'll help you memorize it by writing it. It'll also help you eliminate from making a mistake. So take a minute, copy down the formula again. Then we want to go to our points, we want to label them. Point 1 is our x1, y1. Point 2 is our x2, y2. If you do that part wrong, then the rest of the problem is wrong. Okay, so just take your time that you label this correctly. Then we substitute into our formula. So distance equals, now the only thing they don't show you in the formula is there is technically like a bracket or a parenthesis, like grouping everything under the square root. Okay, so you want to do everything inside until you get a single number, then take your square root. So let's substitute in. x2 is 1. There's a subtraction sign in the formula, we bring that down. x1 is a negative 1. I'm going to put parentheses when I insert that negative 1. Close my parentheses squared. y2 is 2. There's a subtraction in the formula, and there's a negative in my y1, so I'm going to put parentheses. Now I know a lot of you would just go ahead and change that to a plus, which is okay. Okay, but to show all of my work in the notes, I do put it all out. So then we can simplify. This will become 1 plus 1 squared, and this will become 2 plus 2 squared. Just like we did in the bell ringer, you want to simplify order of operations, parentheses first, so we'll get 2 squared plus 4 squared. Now you cannot just undo the square with the square root and make it like 2 plus 4 is 6. Okay, some people are like, can I just like cancel those out? No. You actually need to perform this operation inside. Okay, so I will get 2 squared is 4. 4 squared is 16, not 8. Add them together. We get the square root of 20. Which, for those of you that took Algebra 2, you could reduce that to 2 squared to 5. But they want us to round to the nearest tenth. So we're going to go ahead and type that into our calculator. I want everyone to try it to make sure you know how to use your new calculator, because I know some of you bought new ones. If you're using your grapher, you're just pressing second x squared and then 20. And then who can round that to the nearest tenth? Sheila?
About 4.5.
Good, 4.5. Now we would want to attach units since they gave them to us. They usually don't, but they did tell us that this is 1 mile. So this would be 4.5 miles. Okay. Really, after I show you one, you should be able to do them on your own, but I'll do one more with you, and then I'll have you guys try the last one on your own. Again, this one has no graph, it just has the ordered pairs. So we'll label them. Point 1 is x1, y1, and point 2 is x2, y2. Copy down our formula again. These problems are not hard, but there are lots of mistakes you can make with just a negative somewhere that throws off the whole answer. So take your time. Now we'll substitute in negative 2. Make sure you bring the subtraction down that was in the formula. Minus 6, quantity squared, plus 4 minus in the formula a negative 2. Quantity squared. Okay, just to shortcut my work, I am going to go ahead and notice that these two negatives are going to turn to a positive, just to save myself from copying that a whole other time. So on your homework, I want to see this line, and then I don't care how you simplify from there. If you want to do stuff mentally, go for it. Just don't screw it up. Right? But I want to see at least the formula, the substitution, and then I want to see your final answer. But you should be doing a little bit more work. Negative 2 minus 6 is negative 8. Leave this in parentheses. If you just put negative 8 squared without parentheses, there's a good chance you're going to put negative 64 there, which it should be a positive 64. So leave parentheses around any negative number that's being squared. Okay. Here we're going to get 4 plus 2, which is 6 squared. Now again, some of you rely on your calculator, which you shouldn't be doing a calculator for this. You don't need it until you get to the very last step. But I do just want to draw attention because I don't want you to get the answer wrong because you put it in your calculator wrong. Again, if you were to put in -8 squared, your calculator will give you the wrong answer. But they're giving you the right answer for what you typed in. So if you were someone who relies on your calculator to even type in 2 plus 2, so there's some of you that just want to be sure, make sure you're inputting the stuff you put in there properly. Okay, you would have to put parentheses around there to get the right number. I can't tell you how many students I'll see put this stuff in their calculator and then they get negative. And then their whole problem's wrong from there on. So I get 64 plus 36, which gets me 100. And we don't even need a calculator. The square root of 100 is 10. Now it did say round to the nearest 10, so technically, but I wouldn't take off points if you just put 10. Okay, usually the directions will say when necessary, round to the nearest 10, which will mean if you get a decimal, then round. But if you just have 10, that's fine. All right, I'd like you guys to try example B on your own. The square root of 625 is actually a perfect square, so it would be exactly 25 actually. So it should be 25. Again, we would put 25.0 technically since the direction said, but if you just have 25, that's fine. All right, so that would be the length of segment AB, which is in our coordinate, or excuse me, LM, that's in our coordinate plane. So just take your time with those questions, okay? Because there's a lot of room for error just by plugging in the wrong spots or forgetting to bring the subtraction sign in the formula or a negative somewhere. Okay, the last thing we'll look at is the midpoint formula, which I think is actually easier, if that's possible. So before when we did the midpoint, which actually a lot of you made a mistake on your quiz, let's say this was on a number line, and A was at 2 on the number line, and B was at 10 on the number line. How long is AB? 8. What's the midpoint? What's the coordinate of the midpoint? Aiden? No. Emma? 6. Okay. So yes, we take the distance and we divide it in half to get 4. But 4 is not the middle point. 4 is how far away from either endpoint that it is. So the midpoint is 4 units away from 2. So 2 plus 4 would get me 6. Or 6 plus 4 would get me 10. Okay, so some of you on your quiz yesterday just took the distance of whatever the segment was, which this wasn't the problem, but you just divided it by 2. So just be careful. Today, the segment we'll see is now slanted, so we have to take into account an x and a y. Okay? Basically, all you're going to do is you're going to find the average or the mean of the x values and the y values. And then that will get you your ordered pair. So we'll have 2 points, just like we did in the distance formula. The formula, though, this M out front stands for the midpoint. Notice there's no equal sign, so it's not technically a formula. It doesn't have an equation. But to calculate the midpoint, you're going to add the x and the x values together and divide by 2, which is finding the average. And then you'll notice there's a comma here separating whatever you get. So your final answer will be something, comma, something. It's an ordered pair. Because the midpoint will have to be a coordinate now, not just a number. Same thing with the y's. We'll add our y's and divide by 2. So, one more video. It's the same girls.
Midpoint, what do you do? Add them together and divide by 2.
They have a dance.
Midpoint. What do you do? Add them together and divide by 2.
So this one is a little bit more general.
How much did they get paid?
I believe this was
How did you use?
probably for a grade. Most of these, if you look at them, they're students. So you could just be happy I'm not assigning that as homework. But there are a couple others if you would be interested. Sheridan, you remember Quadratic Formula Cup song? Remember Adele, Rolling in the Deep?
No.
You have to wait for Algebra 2 to learn the fun ones.
When will we do that? No.
In Algebra 2, we'll get there in a month or so.
Yeah, before you even through
I've been through it.
I will after we do our examples. I'll play it for you. Okay.
It's probably the same one Mr. Phelps plays.
The Mr. Phil played it just with One Direction.
The one needed was
Yeah, there's quite a few out there. There's a lot of good ones. All right.
One Direction.
So when we're asked to find the midpoint, you want to make sure you read the directions. If they want you to find the distance, do the distance. If they want to find the midpoint, find the midpoint. So again, for point 1, we'll label this x1, y1. And for point 2, we'll label this x2, y2. And then you just have to plug in the formula. Now, for those of you that are visual learners, you're just averaging the first number on the first number, the x's. And then you're, just put it on my desk. Then you're averaging the 2 y values, adding them together. Okay, but subbing those into our formula, again, this m is just calling the midpoint point m, kind of. That's what this is standing for. So we'll have 8 plus a negative 6, all over 2. And y1 is 9. y2 is negative 3, all over 2. Now, since there's a big fraction bar, this is grouped, the numerator, so you have to perform that instead of dividing each of them by 2. You'll add these first and then divide. So 8 plus a negative 6 is like 8 minus 6, which is 2. 9 plus a negative 3 is like 9 minus 3, which is 6. And then we would just simplify. We'll get 1 and 3. So the midpoint of this is 1, comma 3. And again, all this is saying is that this is point M. So if you were looking at this segment, which would be A, B, it would be slanted downward based on how it looks. Point M would be in the middle, and its coordinates would be 1, comma 3. See if you guys can try example 4. All right, so the final example, we should have gotten that the midpoint was 4, comma 1. Again, midpoint's usually easier for you than distance because there's just less going on. The closure just had a little blank for you to fill in the formulas. You again do need to memorize them by the chapter 1 test, which is on Tuesday, which I believe that is the 19th. Let's see. Yes, it's the day before open house. So you don't want to do bad on it because then I'll see your parents at open house the next day. I'll have to break the news to them.
My parents have never been to open house.
So make sure that you're aware of that.